Hello YouTube, today I'm here to discuss German volume training with you guys. And there are different iterations of the principle, but there are certain things that I want to focus on when it comes to this video. And it's going to be mostly the volume meme that I'm going to discuss, because I also want to make a video about the intensity meme, the 10 by 10 principle, so the set scheme, the rep scheme, and how it actually works, if it's good or not. And then the entire idea of volume in and of itself as existing as a separate entity in your program. So first off, if you follow the hypertrophy series, you will know that I personally preach an approach of balance between volume and intensity, because volume by itself means absolutely nothing. Or if it does mean something, it's not a numerical value that is correlated with something like tonnage, for example. It's just going to represent sets and reps. So it's sort of an empty shell. And if you don't apply an intensity to a volume, you can't do it. Meaning that you can technically think about doing a 3x3, for example, but to materialize the 3x3 in reality, you need to apply a weight. You can't just do a 3x3 of nothing. It needs to be a 3x3 of 100 pounds. And when you do that, you've applied an intensity to it. So whenever you hear someone say they do volume training, either they don't understand what volume means, or they fail to realize that they're also doing intensity training, but the values are skewed. And the reason why the values are skewed is because usually when people say volume, what they really mean is high reps. That's what they mean by volume, which can be sometimes untrue. You can do volume and not do high reps. If you do 50 sets of 3 reps, you're doing low reps, you're doing high volume. Why? Because you're doing high sets. There are things to balance when it comes to actually explaining things like this, because if you don't, you just end up completely losing grasp on the programming principles, and that's actually dangerous, because then you just don't even understand what you're doing yourself. So when someone tells you that they're doing German volume training or high volume training, what they really should be saying is, I'm doing low intensity training, because the defining trait of the program is just as much the high volume as the low intensity. Both values exemplify the program just as well. And it's the same for high intensity. It entails low volume, but it doesn't have to. Okay, and that's my main gripe and issue with 10 by 10 is you don't have to let yourself fall within low intensity windows just to be able to do high volume. There is a way to do high volume, and 10 by 10 is not that. So let's start with this. Let's start with discussing the rep scheme by itself. My issues with 10 by 10 can pretty much be summed up by the video I made about 5 by 5, because the same issues apply. Meaning that a 5 by 5 already represents a rep range that virtually makes sure that you cannot go to failure the first few sets, because if you did go to failure at 5 sets, at 5 reps, you wouldn't have been able to repeat the sets, because then you would be spent, right? You would have gotten 5 and then 4 and maybe 4, 3, 2. It wouldn't be repeatable. So you're sandbagging is what you're doing. It's already sandbagging when you do a 3 by 5. It's even more of a sandbagging practice when you do a 5 by 5. Now picture a 10 by 10. It's all the way. And that's the reason why in that video I said the more sets and reps you add, the more terrible it becomes, because the more of that sandbagging practice you're going to apply. So that's already a bad thing. And then you have to look at what 10 by 10 also entails, because if we're doing just a 10 by 10, all right, and I'm not discussing rest in between the sets or the lift you're doing, which is already being generous, because that's not what German volume training is, but I'll get to that later. If I just look at 10 by 10, besides the sandbagging, you're also going to have the issue of being limited by something that is not muscular failure, because a 10 by 10 is going to be challenging for your cardiovascular system. And the issue is that usually lifts that challenge the cardiovascular system are lifts that are going to be tough to do in the moment, that might take more time for you to catch your breath, but that eventually gives you that opportunity because the sets are not repeated. Here, there are 10 sets. So there's a very strong sense that at some point you're going to enter a set where your breath is still ragged and you're not going to be able to complete the set, not because you even went close to failure, or because your muscles were put under the strain necessary to grow, but just because your lungs and heart couldn't actually, handle the load. They couldn't handle the stress put on the system. So that's an issue. And then in terms of tonnage, because for me, when I think about programming, when I think about the goal of training for bodybuilding, I think about tonnage. Look at the tonnage of a 10 by 10. It's 100. That's insanely high tonnage. That can represent a tonnage that exceeds an entire training session for some people. It's possible, especially when you consider that certain lifts are going to be applied to the 10 by 10 that make it so. If you think about it that way, you might think, well, that's actually a good thing, right? If tonnage accumulation is what we want, wouldn't getting 100 be amazing? Yeah, but it sounds too good to be true, isn't it? We want to accumulate tonnage, and we're just suddenly gifted 100. That's a fairy tale. It's not high quality tonnage. And that's sort of the discrepancy I described in the tonnage video in the hypertrophy series. There is tonnage and tonnage. The reason why I like the idea of tonnage is because it puts together volume and intensity, which those two values need to exist together to make sense. But you can still have something that is going to fall within irrelevant intensity windows that is still applied within the tonnage calculation. So in reality, there are two tonnages. There's the total tonnage and there's the relevant tonnage. Total tonnage is going to be every lift you did. Warm-ups count, back-off sets count, everything goes. And then the relevant tonnage, which is the one that you should be paying attention to, is the one that you accumulate during your hard sets, or what some call walking sets. The issue with a 10 by 10 is that none of these sets was a hard set, because you sandbagged your way through the set. So that's a big problem. And if you think about it, someone who has, let's say, 10,000 tonnage, and someone who has 1,000 tonnage, you might think, okay, the guy who has 10,000 is going to grow more. There is no way around it. Not necessarily, because you can always find ways to accumulate low quality tonnage in intensity windows that are going to help you accumulate and accumulate and accumulate, get a super high number, but at the end of the day, it means nothing. If I make you do squats with 100 pounds, you can accumulate tens of thousands of tonnage. Are your legs going to grow from that? No. You're going to get the signs of pain, challenge, you're going to get a pump, and eventually you will realize that what you're doing is just cardio with a barbell. We're going to take a quick pause here, and I'll be back. Back. So what I said was, in reality, the amount of work you did with the 10 by 10, the amount of fatigue, of stress that you put yourself through, resulted in a tonnage number that is not going to be correlated with the progress you think you will get. And I would even argue that you could have made better gains doing only 3 sets with a more relevant intensity window. Some people will disagree with that, but to me, in terms of progression over time, in terms of actual fatigue within the set and the ability to go to failure, in terms of recuperation between sets, all of these factors make 10 by 10 highly irrelevant in my opinion. Now that was just the rep range. It wasn't even the training principle. That's just the rep range that's already bad. And the worst thing I see with the 10 by 10 is that it's always applied to supplemental lifts. I tend to see it like this, meaning that German volume training usually tends to be for strength work, but I've seen people prescribe 10 by 10s as back-off sets, like follow-up sets, deep within the workouts sometimes. Sometimes it's set number 3, and I'm thinking, who do you think is going to do strength work, then a back-off set of strength work, then has juice for a 10 by 10? It doesn't make any sense. The only context where I would see that making sense would be a full body workout, where the 10 by 10 is the only lift for that body part. But even then, you could just do a lesser amount of set and do something more relevant in terms of intensity. So now let's talk about German volume training. So I sort of did my research a little bit. It was first implemented in the training of Olympic weightlifters, which makes sense because if you look at their training and if you look at strength training tends to have hypertrophy blocks, strength blocks. They have different specific training for specific periods of the year. Why? Because they compete. They have to prove their strength on the platform. It doesn't work like that for bodybuilding. Blocks for bodybuilding are pretty much useless in my opinion because you don't have to have them. And the reason why powerlifters and Olympic weightlifters have them is because they have to. Because you cannot focus on the values of strength and size at the same time. But over time, to progress on strength, you need to build muscle mass that can potentiate power. Bodybuilders don't need that because your strength progression is going to be much slower and you don't need it to peak. At no point do you need it to peak. And since size never really peaks for a bodybuilder, it's a constant struggle and a slow progression, the issue is also not there. So you don't need that. So that's already a mindset and a rep scheme that was taken from a different discipline and practice and transformed into the practice of bodybuilding. And bodybuilders use that. I sort of checked to see the big figures of the movement. It was quite popular, it is still quite popular, people swear by it. And I think the reason why people swear by it is the same reason why people love high intensity training, is because these are people who have never really experienced volume before. And therefore, they go way too high and way too hard on volume because they get gains from it. And that's perfectly normal. If you're the type of person who never really experienced high reps on the squat, the first time you do high reps, you're going to get gains. Why? Because you might have multiplied your tonnage by 4. If you're the type of person who kept doing sets of 5 on the squats and you go up to sets of 10, you doubled your tonnage. And especially if you do an extra set or 2, it can triple or quadruple your tonnage. And that's the pendulum swing that I keep talking about. Is 10 by 10 is the extremity. It's way too high. It's like a last resort volume technique. It's not needed. You don't need to go so high. So now, when it comes to 10 by 10, there's also the issue of the rest and the tempo, because if you do a proper 10 by 10 following the German volume training principles, you need to do 10 sets of 10 reps with only 60 seconds in between each set and a tempo of 4:02. So it's 4 seconds negative, no pause, up, 2 seconds positive. That is insane. And especially if you look at the percentages applied to that, because some people apply 70-75%. For that, it's not possible. That's not a true 70%. It's what I would call a relative intensity window, because you're not lifting an absolute 70% of your 1 rep max for 10 reps, then resting 60 seconds, and then 10 reps again. It's not possible. So most people, what they do is they take 60%, 55%. It's a way that they can easily rep 20 times in reality, and they do it 10 times. So there's already a problem with what I just said. Not only are you sandbagging within the rep range that you practice, which is 10, but in reality, you are sandbagging beyond that, because you're also sandbagging what you could be doing for 20 reps. So it's really bad. That's the reason why I say that the more you stray away from what I would consider the only static rep range where there's no sandbagging, which is 1 set of whatever reps, the more you stray from that by adding sets or adding reps, the further away you come. And when I see people who prescribe like 5 sets of 20, it's the same logic. It's just plain bad. Why? Because progression doesn't just happen from session to session. It happens within the workout, but in reverse, meaning that the progression you will experience in the gym for your tonnage is going to be correlated with the ability of the body to repeat muscular endurance within the session when the set declines. Meaning that if you do a set, a real set, and you go to failure, you got 10 reps, next set you'll get 9 or 8, you won't get 10. If you got 10, you sandbag on the first one, but that's fine because you get 10, 9, 8, and you're proving to yourself, and your muscle is showing you that it can't recuperate. It cannot go back to baseline, it cannot get 10 reps, which means what? You're damaging the muscle, and the muscle is going to have to rest afterwards, and the goal of a training session should be to damage the muscle so much that eventually the baseline can never recover to a level of relevant intensity that makes sense when it comes to your absolute intensity, which means you're fatigued enough that muscle group is tired and now you can rest because it will grow. That's how I think of training. 10 by 10 doesn't do that because you're still getting 10 reps at the 10th set. So in reality, you're making sure that you're training the muscle, but you never really give a chance to the muscle to go to failure, and that's bad. And then, the things that I said about cardiovascular endurance are even truer when it comes to a real German volume training principle, because 60-second interval in between reps, if you do squats, even with very high cardiovascular endurance, it will be limiting. So again, as I said, it's you sandbag because you do 10 reps that you could do for 20, so you sandbag twice, and now you're letting your lungs and heart limit the ability of what you were already doing with the first sandbagging. So it's the third sandbagging. That's a lot of sand. And that's, I say that why? I say that because you might fail a set of 10 that doesn't even represent 60% of your absolute intensity. And yet you fail it. That's awful, because if you're doing super high reps just to say, oh, it's tonnage accumulation, I don't care about the quality, which is already a bad idea. By the way, it's the reason why I use that thumbnail, because it's wrong. It's an ironic thumbnail in a sense, because it shows the misunderstanding that people have with volume. Total volume doesn't matter. If it's not in relevant intensity window, it doesn't matter. I'm starting to speak super fast for some reason. Let's calm down. So when it comes to that, it's the same issue too here with the 10 by 10. And you will find as well that the energy that you expend for a 10 by 10 is going to widely exceed the result. And a lot of that is going to come from the fact that, again, the cardiovascular system is extremely burnt out, the fact that you're going to suffer a lot of metabolic fatigue from that. And you might think to yourself, okay, does that mean that I never do high reps, especially for stuff like squat or deadlift? No, not necessarily. I think high reps is good. The issue is the repetition of high reps, because in reality, if you do 10 reps, that's fine and all. If you repeat it 10 times, you just devalued the value of these 10 reps because you didn't do 10 reps. That's what I said about the sandbagging example. In reality, you did 10 reps that could have been 20 that are going to be limited by your lungs. So it's the reason why I also call that the high volume meme, is because it's sort of like people who really want to do volume, but they don't want to do what real volume entails. And so they just found something that they sense as being close enough to volume that it represents a valid replacement, but it really doesn't, because it's the simulation of hardship I like to talk about. When you do 10 reps of 10, you never really went to failure. You never really challenge the body to move heavy weights. What you challenge is your cardiovascular endurance, but that is going to make you feel tired because you're breathless. Most likely you will sleep very well. Most likely you will have DOMS the day afterwards because your muscles are full of lactic acid because you moved them a bunch. That's, to me, just, it's hardship, great, you suffered. Is it going to result in gains? Most likely not. And the easiest proof to that is any rep range for bodybuilding. Any rep range that you cannot repeat over the course of a year and make steady gains on is not a good rep range. Unless it's a lift or a set somewhere in the program where you said, this is irrelevant. I'm just doing that because it's pure tonnage accumulation with no idea or scheme of progression behind it, which should represent 5% of the training, no more, because you need the rest to progress for tonnage to progress. Because once you get advanced enough, progression is tough enough. You don't need to sabotage yourself by introducing sets that already don't progress because you program them so, if that makes sense. And I can tell you that on the 10 by 10, you will start making gains at first because you're adapting and most likely you've never done high reps before, but the adaptation you're getting is your cardiovascular system getting better. It's your ability to recuperate between sets getting better. So in reality, your intra-workout recovery increases, but your weekly recovery doesn't, because you don't really tax the muscle. You're training the muscle to be able to handle light loads at quick intervals. But to me, that's not really hypertrophic. And so that is something that is not conducive to progression at all. You can try if you want. If you're past the noob phase, do a 10 by 10 on a lift. Tell me how fast you progress at first, and then tell me how fast you plateau. At some point, you can't progress anymore. Why? The rep range is not flexible at all. It gives you no leeway. You do 10 sets of 10. That's what you do. Great. If I can't do that, then what? Then nothing. And the worst part is that even if you can get 10 by 10, look at how steep the progression is. Because again, 10 by 10 represents 100 tonnage. So if it's 100 tonnage, if you had 1 pound, it's 1 pound added to 10 sets of 10 reps. That is an immense amount of progression. It's a lot. If you think of it as in terms of percentages, it's a progression that either means that if you can get it next time, you either massively, so again, fourth sandbagging. If you can actually just put 5 pounds or 10 pounds on the bar and get that 10 by 10 the next week, most likely you just sandbag the first 10 by 10, so you sandbag the fourth time, or you are experiencing something that I would say is neurological or cardiovascular adaptation that is going to run out eventually. Or even if it doesn't run out, you're just training to be a better, cardio athlete in a sense, because you're just really being good at oxygenating the body. So what's the point? If your goal was size in the first place, what's the point? So a lot of things to say, and apparently a lot of things are negative, but I really cannot think of a single thing positive about it. At least 5x5 and 3x5s, they have their merit because they're good for novices, because they're going to work. They are sort of teaching novices how to do reps, how to regulate their muscular endurance, how to repeat form. But 10 by 10 for novices for most of the time is going to be either the rep range that break their spirit when it comes to actually training, the rep range that makes them think that volume doesn't work because they're never going to be able to recuperate from it, or it just becomes their new religion, so they're going to be a new apostle of the German volume training school. And again, a lot of these principles that sort of look like fringe applications of programming are just that, and the people who tend to push them are people on steroids. So if you need to have that one guy who's big and massive on PED to be the representative for your training, to me it's a show that it's a sign that the training principle is bad. Because if it was good, you wouldn't need that. It would be self-evident that it's a good way to train. So I think I've covered pretty much everything I wanted to say with a 10 by 10. It doesn't mean that you can't do it. The issue I see is that for all of the reasons I explained, this is typically something you're going to want to do between 4 and 6 weeks, and that's a block. That's typically a block, and I don't advise you to do blocks. Your program should be something that is so complete and complex, not complicated, complex, that its evolution is contained within it. So the rotations are within the program. The variations of the reps and the schemes are contained within evolving rep ranges. But you don't need the application or invasion of a foreign rep scheme to just explode in the middle of the program and then leave in 6 weeks. To me, that just shows that it's replacing something that wasn't there in the first place, which is volume. It means that you didn't apply volume principles properly in your program before, and now you're sort of forced to do a crash course to be able to catch up, and that is just, you're putting a band-aid on an axe wound, and that's not going to stop the hemorrhage. If anything, it's just going to infect the wound. So I'm going to leave you with that. I'm sure there are other things that I want to say about 10 by 10. Most likely I will develop them more in the hypertrophy Q&A this Sunday if the question has been asked. If not, you can ask in the comments and we'll discuss it together. But that's pretty much all I have for you guys today. Thank you for watching. See you soon.